सत श्री अकाल। इंडिया प्लस यूएसए देख रहे सब दर्शकों का मैं मनप्रीत कौर स्वागत करती हाँ। यूक्रेन की हथियारों नाल मदद करने वाले देशों को रूस की धमकी, कहा इसके जिम्मेवार तुसीं खुद होवोगे। जंग विचाले यूक्रेन लिए आई बुरी खबर, रूस मगरों बेलारूस ने भी किया ऐलान है जंग। यूक्रेन के शहरों में जोरदार हुई बमबारी, सैटेलाइट तस्वीरों च होया खुलासा। जंग कारण लग रही है पाबंदियों तो भड़किया रूस, 36 देशों खिलाफ लिया वड्डा फैसला। यूएन की एमरजेंसी मीटिंग च बोलिया यूक्रेन, रूस का झूठ नहीं साडे हंझू वेखो, ये कहर रोको। आओ शुरुआत करते हैं अज की इस पहली वड्डी खबर तो। यूक्रेन की हथियारों नाल मदद करने वाले देशों को रूस की धमकी, कहा इसके जिम्मेवार तुसीं खुद होवोगे। यूक्रेन खिलाफ रूस की फौजी कार्रवाई मंगलवार को 6वें दिन भी जारी है। दुनिया भर के कई देश यूक्रेन को हथियार आदि भेज के मदद कर रहे हैं। इस विचाले रूस ने इन्होंने देशों को चेतावनी दी है कि जे इन्होंने हथियारों का रूस खिलाफ इस्तेमाल किया गया तो इन्हों भेजने वाला देश जिम्मेवार होगा। फौजी टकराव विचाले इस संकट को हल करने दी डिप्लोमैटिक्स कोशिशों भी जारी हैं। यूक्रेन संकट से यूनाइटेड नेशन ह्यूमन राइट्स कौंसल ते एमरजेंसी डिबेट का प्रस्ताव दिता सी। इस प्रस्ताव के पक्ष में 29 ते विरोधी धीर में 5 वोटां पईयां। भारत सने 13 देशों ने वोटिंग में हिस्सा नहीं लिया। UNHRC विच कुल 47 मैंबर हैं। दस्सणयोग है कि SBI ने रूस दी पाबंदीशुदा संस्थावां नाल व्यापार करना बंद कर दिता है। दूजे पासे रूस ने अपने लोगों के विदेश विच मनी ट्रांसफर ते रोक लगा दी है। फ्रांस ने यूक्रेन विच अपनी अंबैसी नूं कीव तो लीव विच ट्रांसफर कर दिता है। आस्ट्रेलिया यूक्रेन नूं 75,000 मिलियन डॉलर देवेगा। यूरोपी देश यूक्रेन नूं 75 फाइटर प्लेन देणगे। रूसी हमले विच हुण तक 352 यूक्रेनी लोगों की जान जा चुकी है, जिन्हां विच 16 बच्चे भी शामिल हैं। यूक्रेनी डिप्लोमेट ने UNGA की मीटिंग विच इस बारे जानकारी दी। यूक्रेन के अधिकारियों ने रूसी फौज के खारकीव विच एक रिहायशी इलाके विच रॉकेट दागण का दोष लगाया, जिस विच दर्जनां नागरिक मारे गए। जंग विचाले यूक्रेन लिए आई बुरी खबर, रूस मगरों बेलारूस ने भी किया ऐलान है जंग। रूस नाल जंग विच यूक्रेन लिए बुरी खबर सामने आई है। हुण बेलारूस भी यूक्रेन खिलाफ जंग विच उतर आया है। खनौकी के उपर एक जहाज़ उड़दा देखा गया है जो बहुत घट उचाई ते सरहद वाल जा रहा सी। इस तो इलावा 10:30 बजे दक्षिण वाल जांदा हैलीकॉप्टर देखा गया सी। रिपोर्ट विच सामने आया है कि गोमेल तो यूक्रेन वाल KA-52 एलीगेटर हैलीकॉप्टर के लिए उड़ान भरी सी। रूसी सैनिकों ने सोमवार को यूक्रेन के दूजे सब तो वड्डे शहर खारकीव बमबारी की। इस दे नाल ही रूसी फौज यूक्रेन की राजधानी कीव के नेड़े पहुंच गई है ते रूसी टैंक ते होर फौजी वाहन लगभग 40 मील के काफले विच कूच कर रहे हैं। इस दे नाल ही जंग नूं रोकण लई चल रही गलबात के अगले दौर की सहमति बनने नाल ही खत्म हो गई है। यूक्रेन के राष्ट्रपति वोलोदिमीर ज़ेलेंस्की ने कहा है कि बम धमाकिਆਂ विच वाधा सिर्फ उसके दबाव पाउण लई सी। सोमवार देर रात जारी किए गए एक वीडियो संदेश विच उन्होंने कहा है कि रूस इन्हां आसान तरीकों नाल ते दबाव पाउण की कोशिश कर रहा है। हालांकि ज़ेलेंस्की ने कहा है कि दिन पहला दोवां धिरां विचकार लंबी गलबात का वेरवा नहीं दिता, पर उन्होंने कहा है कि कीव कोई रियायत देने लई तैयार नहीं है। वह भी उदों जदों एक पासे राकेट और तोपां दे हमले किए जा रहे हैं। 6 दिनों की जंग तो रूस अलग हुंदा जा रहा है, जबकि उसनूं यूक्रेन ने अनकियासे विरोध की सामना करना पिया है। घरेलू पद्धर ते रूस नूं आर्थिक तौर पर नुकसान होया है। यूक्रेन के शहरों में जोरदार हुई बमबारी, सैटेलाइट तस्वीरों च होया खुलासा। रूस ते यूक्रेन विचाले चल रही खतरनाक जंग का अज 6वां दिन है। इन्हां 6 दिनों में रूस ने रुक रुक के यूक्रेन ते कई मिसाइलां छड्डियां हैं। इन्हां हमलिਆਂ नाल यूक्रेन लगभग तबाह हो चुका है, पर फिर भी ना तो रूस ते ना ही यूक्रेन झुकण नूं तैयार है। हालांकि बीते दिनी बेलारूस च दोहां देशों विचाले गलबात हुई, पर इस समस्या का कोई हल नहीं निकल सकिया। रूसी फौज इस समय यूक्रेन की राजधानी कीव विच दाखिल हो रही है। इस दौरान यूक्रेन विच हुई तबाही दी ताज़ा सैटेलाइट तस्वीरां सामने आईयां हन। तस्वीर विच साफ-साफ देखा जा सकता है कि यूक्रेन पूरी तरह नाल घिरिया होया है। रूसी हथियारबंद बलों का एक वड्डा काफला कीव के नेड़े जा रहा है। ऐतवार नूं मैक्स टैक्नोलॉजी तो सैटेलाइट तस्वीरां ते शुरू विच घट तो घट 100 वाहनां का एक समूह दिखाया, जदों कि सोमवार नूं इह कीव के बाहरवार एटोनोव हवाई अड्डे ते लगभग 20 मील उत्तर वाल अते शहर की सीमा तो 10 मील दूर सी। तस्वीरां विच देखा जा सकता है कि वाहनां का एक काफला घट्टो घट 17 मील तक फैलिया होया है। वाहनां की लाइन इन्नी वड्डी है ਕਿ ਸੈਟੇਲਾਈਟ ਤਸਵੀਰਾਂ ਇਸ ਨੂੰ ਪੂਰੀ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਹਾਸਲ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕੀਆਂ ਹਨ। ਇਹ ਸੈਟੇਲਾਈਟ ਤਸਵੀਰਾਂ ਦਿਖਾਉਂਦੀਆਂ ਹਨ ਕਿ ਰੂਸੀ ਫੌਜੀ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਤੇ ਕਈ ਮੋਰਚਿਆਂ ਤੇ ਹਮਲਾ ਕਰ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਹਨ ਅਤੇ ਕੀਵ ਵੱਲ ਵੱਧ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਹਨ। ਇਹ ਸੈਂਕੜੇ ਬਖਤਰਬੰਦ ਗੱਡੀਆਂ ਦਾ ਕਾਫਲਾ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਟੈਂਕ ਹਨ। ਹਥਿਆਰਬੰਦ ਟੈਂਕ ਤਬਾਹੀ ਦੇ ਸਮਾਨ ਨਾਲ ਲੱਦੇ ਹੋਏ ਹਨ। ਇਹ ਲਕਸ਼ਰ ਕੀਵ ਤੋਂ ਸਿਰਫ 25 ਕਿਲੋਮੀਟਰ ਦੂਰ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਇਲਾਵਾ ਤਸਵੀਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿਰਫ ਕੀਵ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਦੇ ਬਾਹਰ ਲੜਾਈ ਦੇ ਨਿਸ਼ਾਨ ਦਿਖਾਈ ਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਹਨ। ਤਸਵੀਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਜੰਗ ਵਿੱਚ ਤਬਾਹੀ ਅਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਟੁੱਟਿਆ ਪੁਲ ਅਤੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਤਬਾਹ ਹੋਏ ਵਾਹਨ ਦਿਖਾਏ ਗਏ ਹਨ। ਜੰਗ ਕਾਰਨ ਲੱਗ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਪਾਬੰਦੀਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਭੜਕਿਆ ਰੂਸ। 36 ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਲਿਆ ਵੱਡਾ ਫੈਸਲਾ। ਰੂਸ ਅਤੇ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਵਿਚਾਲੇ ਜਾਰੀ ਜੰਗ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਤੇਜ਼ੀ ਨਾਲ ਘਟਨਾਕ੍ਰਮ ਬਦਲ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। ਜੰਗ ਦੇ ਦਰਮਿਆਨ ਰੂਸੀ ਸਰਕਾਰ ਨੇ ਵੱਡਾ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ। ਦਰਅਸਲ ਰੂਸ ਨੇ 36 ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੀਆਂ ਉਡਾਨਾਂ ਤੇ ਪਾਬੰਦੀ ਲਾਉਣ ਦਾ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਲਿਆ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਪਾਬੰਦੀ ਬ੍ਰਿਟੇਨ ਅਤੇ ਜਰਮਨੀ ਵਰਗੇ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਆਉਣ ਵਾਲੀਆਂ ਉਡਾਨਾਂ ਤੇ ਲਾਗੂ ਹੋਵੇਗੀ। ਦੇਸ਼ ਦੀ ਹਵਾਬਾਜ਼ੀ ਅਥਾਰਟੀ ਨੇ ਇਸ ਦੀ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ। ਦਰਅਸਲ ਰੂਸ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਉਦੋਂ ਆਇਆ ਹੈ ਜਦੋਂ ਯੂਰਪੀਅਨ ਯੂਨੀਅਨ ਨੇ ਰੂਸੀ ਹਵਾਈ ਕੰਪਨੀਆਂ ਲਈ ਆਪਣਾ ਹਵਾਈ ਖੇਤਰ ਬੰਦ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਫੈਸਲਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਦਰਮਿਆਨ ਰੂਸੀ ਵਿਦੇਸ਼ ਮੰਤਰੀ ਲਾਵਰੋਵ ਨੇ ਯੂਰਪੀਅਨ ਯੂਨੀਅਨ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਈ ਖੇਤਰ ਤੇ ਪਾਬੰਦੀ ਕਾਰਨ ਜਿਨੇਵਾ 'ਚ ਸੰਯੁਕਤ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਦੀ ਯਾਤਰਾ ਰੱਦ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ। ਇਹ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਰੂਸੀ ਮਿਸ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਲੇ ਨਾਲ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਗਈ ਹੈ। ਰੂਸ ਨੇ ਸੋਮਵਾਰ ਨੂੰ 36 ਤੋਂ ਵੱਧ ਯੂਰਪੀ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ-ਨਾਲ ਕੈਨੇਡਾ ਲਈ ਆਪਣੇ ਹਵਾਈ ਖੇਤਰ ਨੂੰ ਬੰਦ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਯੂਰਪੀ ਸੰਘ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਰੂਸੀ ਏਅਰਲਾਈਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਹਵਾਈ ਖੇਤਰ ਨੂੰ ਦਾਖਲ ਹੋਣ ਤੇ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਬੰਧ ਲਗਾਉਣ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਇਹ ਕਦਮ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ। ਦਰਅਸਲ ਪੱਛਮੀ ਦੇਸ਼ਾਂ ਨੇ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਤੇ ਹਮਲੇ ਦੇ ਜਵਾਬ 'ਚ ਰੂਸ ਖਿਲਾਫ ਕਈ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਬੰਧ ਲਗਾ ਤੇ ਰੂਸੀ ਅਰਥ ਵਿਵਸਥਾ ਦੀ ਕਮਰ ਤੋੜਨ ਦੀ ਯੋਜਨਾ ਬਣਾਈ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਦਰਮਿਆਨ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਸੈਨਿਕਾਂ ਕੋਲ ਹਥਿਆਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਹੀ ਘੱਟ ਹੋਵੇ, ਪਰ ਦ੍ਰਿੜ ਇਰਾਦਿਆਂ ਨਾਲ ਭਰਪੂਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਸੈਨਿਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਘੱਟ ਤੋਂ ਘੱਟ ਫਿਲਹਾਲ ਰਾਜਧਾਨੀ ਕੀਵ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਮੁੱਖ ਸ਼ਹਿਰਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਰੂਸੀ ਸੈਨਿਕ ਦੀ ਰਫ਼ਤਾਰ ਘੱਟ ਕੀਤੀ ਹੈ। ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਸੈਨਿਕਾਂ ਤੋਂ ਮਿਲ ਰਹੇ ਸਖਤ ਮੁਕਾਬਲੇ ਕਾਰਨ ਪੁਤਿਨ ਨੇ ਰੂਸ ਦੇ ਪਰਮਾਣੂ ਬਲਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਹਾਈ ਅਲਰਟ ਤੇ ਰਹਿਣ ਦਾ ਹੁਕਮ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਹੈ। ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਡਰੇ ਹੋਏ ਲੋਕ ਤਹਿਖਾਨਿਆਂ ਤੇ ਕੋਰੀਡੋਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਹਾਰੇ ਦੀ ਭਾਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਨ। ਮ੍ਰਿਤਕਾਂ ਦੀ ਸਹੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਦਾ ਅਜੇ ਤੱਕ ਪਤਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਲੱਗ ਸਕਿਆ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰਪਤੀ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਘੱਟ ਤੋਂ ਘੱਟ 16 ਬੱਚੇ ਮਾਰੇ ਗਏ ਹਨ ਅਤੇ 45 ਜ਼ਖਮੀ ਹੋਏ ਹਨ। ਲੱਖਾਂ ਲੋਕ ਆਪਣਾ ਘਰ-ਬਾਰ ਛੱਡ ਕੇ ਭੱਜ ਚੁੱਕੇ ਹਨ। ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਇੱਕ ਸੀਨੀਅਰ ਖੁਫੀਆ ਅਧਿਕਾਰੀ ਨੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਵਾਂਢੀ ਦੇਸ਼ ਬੇਲਾਰੂਸ ਰੂਸ ਨੂੰ ਮਦਦ ਲਈ ਆਪਣੀ ਸੈਨਾ ਭੇਜ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ। ਅਧਿਕਾਰੀ ਇਸ ਮਾਮਲੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਧੇ ਤੌਰ ਤੇ ਜਾਣਕਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਦੇ ਹਨ। ਦੂਜੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਬ੍ਰਿਟੇਨ ਤੇ ਰੱਖਿਆ ਮੰਤਰਾਲੇ ਨੇ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਰੂਸੀ ਸੈਨਿਕ ਕੀਵ ਤੋਂ 30 ਕਿਲੋਮੀਟਰ ਉੱਤਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਹਨ, ਪਰ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਸੈਨਿਕਾਂ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਰਫ਼ਤਾਰ ਹੌਲੀ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੈ। UN ਦੀ ਐਮਰਜੈਂਸੀ ਮੀਟਿੰਗ 'ਚ ਬੋਲਿਆ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ, ਰੂਸ ਦਾ ਝੂਠ ਨਹੀਂ, ਸਾਡੇ ਹੰਝੂ ਵੇਖੋ, ਇਹ ਕਹਿਰ ਰੋਕੋ। ਰੂਸ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਯੁੱਧ ਤੇ ਸੰਯੁਕਤ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਮਹਾਸਭਾ ਦੀ ਹੰਗਾਮੀ ਬੈਠਕ 'ਚ ਭਾਰਤ ਨੇ ਇੱਕ ਵਾਰ ਫਿਰ ਸਪਸ਼ਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਵਿਵਾਦਾਂ ਤੇ ਸ਼ਾਂਤੀਪੂਰਨ ਹੱਲ ਦੇ ਪੱਖ 'ਚ ਹੈ। ਸੰਯੁਕਤ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਭਾਰਤ ਦੇ ਸਥਾਈ ਪ੍ਰਤੀਨਿਧੀ TS ਤ੍ਰਿਮੂਰਤੀ ਨੇ 11ਵੀਂ ਐਮਰਜੈਂਸੀ ਵਿਸ਼ੇਸ਼ ਸੈਸ਼ਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਭਾਰਤ ਦੀ ਨੁਮਾਇੰਦਗੀ ਕਰਦਿਆਂ ਕਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਨਵੀਂ ਦਿੱਲੀ ਦਾ ਪੱਕਾ ਵਿਸ਼ਵਾਸ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕੂਟਨੀਤੀ ਦੇ ਰਾਹ ਤੇ ਮੁੜਨ ਤੋਂ ਇਲਾਵਾ ਹੋਰ ਕੋਈ ਚਾਰਾ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ।
Distinguished colleagues, before we start our meeting today, I would like to inform you about yet another hostile step undertaken by the host country. It's a step against the Russian mission. Just now, literally an hour ago, we were informed that from the Russian mission, 12 of its staff are being expelled. This is yet another gross violation by the host country of the UN agreement with the host country of the Vienna Convention, and etc., etc. We have been saying for a long time that we need to start an arbitration procedure on the implementation by the host country of its obligations to maintain normally functioning missions and permanent representations to the UN. Unfortunately, this arbitration to date has not been begun. We keep being told about the need for diplomacy, diplomatic solutions, and at the same time our opportunities to conduct this kind of activity are being restricted. We deeply regret this decision, and we'll see how events develop within the context of this decision. We now have an unofficial meeting now, but I can see that the US representative has asked for the floor.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to take a quick minute. The status of the 12 diplomats you refer to, I don't think is really the proper subject for this meeting, especially given the gravity of what we're here to discuss, which is untold humanitarian suffering in the country of Ukraine. But since you have raised the issue, I will just ensure my colleagues that the step that the United States government informed the Russian mission of today was taken in full accordance with the headquarters agreement that we signed with the UN, and that those diplomats that have been asked to leave the United States were engaged in activities that were not in accordance with their responsibilities and obligations as diplomats. So under Section 13B of the headquarters agreement, they have been given a request to depart this country so they do not harm the national security of the host country. And I look forward to taking the issue up, Mr. President, where it properly belongs, which is the host country committee. Thank you very much.
Indeed, our meeting is not on this, but we do have our own opinion on this, and the explanations which I heard from the representative of the United States are not satisfactory to us. The 8,983rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is letter dated 28th February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, S/2014/136. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting: Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Mr. Filippo Grandi, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths.
Mr. President, I speak to you from Geneva, and wherever you are in the world, we have all been watching the military offensive in Ukraine with a sense of disbelief and horror. As we all feared, civilians are already paying the price. The scale of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, even in these very early days, is alarming. Humanitarian needs are growing at an alarming pace in the hardest hit areas. Civilian children, women, and men have been injured and killed. Homes have been damaged and sometimes destroyed. As of yesterday, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights reported at least 406 civilian casualties, including at least 102 dead in these few days. The real figure could be considerably higher, as many reported casualties have yet to be confirmed. We know, and we will hear, of course, much more from Filippo, that at least 160,000 people have been internally displaced across Ukraine, fleeing for safety. We know that figure is likely to be much higher, potentially a significant proportion of the entire population. And of course, as Filippo will tell you, we believe more than 500,000 refugees have been forced to choose to flee their country in search of safety. So families are separated. The elderly and people with disabilities find themselves trapped and unable to flee, not even able to get that small comfort. The picture is grim and could get worse still. Aerial attacks and fighting in urban areas are damaging critical civilian facilities and disrupting essential services such as health, electricity, water and sanitation, which effectively leaves civilians without the basics for day-to-day life. Bridges and roads have been destroyed, cutting off people's access to critical supplies and services. The use of explosive weapons in urban areas carries a high risk of indiscriminate impact. This is of particular concern in places like Kiev and Kharkiv. Civilians will undeservedly suffer the most from these attacks on densely populated urban centres. It follows. All parties must respect international humanitarian law, take constant care to spare all civilians and civilian objects from harm throughout their military operations. A party should also, of course, avoid the use of wide area explosive weapons in populated areas. And the longer this goes on, the greater the cost will be for civilians. Children will miss school and face a greater risk of physical harm, displacement, and unimaginably severe emotional stress. Women, so often disproportionately affected by conflict, as we have so often discussed in this chamber, will be at even greater risk of gender-based violence, and women and children may be exposed to other forms of exploitation. The economy of Ukraine could implode, which will further exacerbate humanitarian needs and create a ripple effect that travels far beyond Ukraine's borders. Already the upheavals in recent days are deepening a pre-existing humanitarian crisis. 8 grueling years of conflict in eastern Ukraine had already left 3 million people in need of humanitarian assistance on both sides of the contact line in the Donbass region. And it goes without saying that humanitarian needs are now much greater, including the large-scale displacement to which I've already referred, across and beyond the entire country, and not only in one region thereof. Humanitarian workers are doing their best to respond. The UN has expanded its humanitarian presence in Ukraine. We shall continue to do so. We're working to ensure we can scale up our operations as quickly as possible, and we had been preparing for this for some time. I must say that for the last 3 days, however, our movements, the movements of our dear colleagues in Ukraine, have been seriously constrained as a result of ongoing fighting and our inability to receive assurances from the parties to the conflict that humanitarian movements will be protected. And only this evening, I was fortunate to receive the beginning of some assurances to that effect. We must hope that comes into reality. In the meantime, local organizations and institutions are doing, as usual, the truly remarkable job that they do in all such situations, responding to needs. Local NGOs and the Ukrainian Red Cross, are working tirelessly to support civilians and evacuation operations. Health workers working day and night to care for the injured. Aid organizations providing psychosocial support to traumatized children, delivering first aid kits. And we're all here this afternoon to support their efforts. Today, our most pressing humanitarian needs are for emergency medical services, including sexual and reproductive health services, critical medicine, health supplies and equipment, safe water for drinking and hygiene, shelter and protection for the displaced. In all, 119 organizations, partners, humanitarian organizations, are operating in Ukraine, able to provide some form of humanitarian assistance, though clearly stilted in these particular days. Right now, we urgently need progress on 2 fronts if we want to reach more people with aid that they need, that they deserve. First, we need the assurances from parties to the conflict that humanitarian workers and movements will be protected, even during the most severe days of the conflict, and not waiting for the conflict to subside. Even now, even today, even yesterday, we need to provide those protections to those workers to do the job that they want to do. Under international humanitarian law, all parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and must ensure the freedom of movement of humanitarians, a point we have been making in many different ways in these past 4 days. Secondly, of course, we desperately need more resources. Tomorrow, the Secretary General will launch a humanitarian appeal for this crisis with 2 components: a 3-month flash appeal for the situation inside the country and a regional response plan for the situation outside under the leadership of Filippo Grandi and his office. The Secretary General, alongside Filippo, our NGO colleagues, and I, will all call on member states to show support with quick, generous, and flexible funding. And cash will be a major source of delivery of humanitarian assistance in the particular circumstances that obtain in Ukraine. But this is certainly not enough. The lives of millions of civilians are simply at stake. We know from other recent conflicts how brutal, deadly, and protracted urban warfare can be. We know how countries' economies can be devastated, infrastructure, investment, and development gains set back an entire generation. And we know enough to know that we do not yet know what it will be the consequences of the events that we observe today. These things should never happen in any country, anywhere. Every effort, of course, must be made to de-escalate the conflict. The hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have taken the decision to leave their homes to seek safety elsewhere in their country or beyond, and those, even more of them, who remain at peril for the loss of basic services, of pensions, of support, of the services their children need, of the safety of a day that may come and may not. I reiterate finally, Mr. President, the Secretary General's call for the only thing that we must all pray for, an immediate cessation of hostilities. Mr. President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Filippo Grandi.
Mr. President, greetings from Geneva. Today and in recent days, you have heard that the United Nations humanitarian organizations, together with their NGO partners, have remained in Ukraine. Let me start by saying how proud I am that we decided to do so, just like we did in Afghanistan a few months ago. But naturally, as we just heard, our colleagues on the ground, like the rest of the civilian population, are now caught up in this deadly conflict. Many of them were relocated, and military attacks might force them to move again. Yet, they're still striving to deliver help to people in need whenever a small window of relative security allows for humanitarian aid to be distributed, working with partners, including especially national NGOs, often in extremely dangerous circumstances. But we know that we're not even scratching the surface to meet the needs of Ukrainians, including an unknown but surely very substantial number who have been forced to flee their homes over the past days. The situation is moving so quickly, and the levels of risk are so high by now that it is impossible for humanitarians to distribute systematically the help that Ukrainians desperately need. I therefore echo as well the urgent call made by the Secretary General and just a few minutes ago by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and by others indeed. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected and spared, and humanitarian access must be granted for those delivering aid to those impacted by war. A failure to do so will compound the already extraordinary levels of human suffering. Mr. President, in addition to the grave situation inside Ukraine, and as Martin just told us, hundreds of thousands are seeking refuge in neighboring countries. They need safety and protection, first and foremost, but also shelter, food, hygiene, and other support, and they need it urgently. As we speak, there are 520,000 refugees from Ukraine in neighboring countries. This figure has been rising exponentially, hour after hour, literally, since Thursday. I have worked in refugee crisis for almost 40 years, and I have rarely seen such an incredibly fast rising exodus of people. The largest, surely, within Europe since the Balkan Wars. Over 280,000 have fled to Poland. Another 94,000 to Hungary. Nearly 40,000 are currently in Moldova. 34,000 in Romania. 30,000 in Slovakia. Tens of thousands in other European countries. We're also aware that a sizable number have gone to the Russian Federation. I want to commend the governments of receiving countries for allowing refugees access to their territory. The challenge to admit and register, to meet the needs and ensure the protection of those fleeing are daunting. But so far they have been met, though I am seriously concerned about the likely and further escalation in the number of arrivals. Mr. President, we may have just seen the beginning. So my message today is one of gratitude to the governments of Ukraine's neighbors, and also through them, my heartfelt thanks to the citizens of those countries, ordinary Poles, Hungarians, Moldovans, Romanians, Slovaks, and citizens of other European countries have undertaken extraordinary acts of humanity and kindness. This is the humanitarian instinct that is so needed in times of crisis. I encourage governments to continue to maintain access to territory for all those fleeing. Ukrainians, of course, but also third country nationals living in Ukraine, people there to work and to study, and in some cases, people that are in Ukraine as refugees, and all of whom are now similarly forced to escape the violence. At this critical juncture, there can be no discrimination against any person or any group. I'm aware that the European Union, its member states, and other governments have already provided countries receiving refugees from Ukraine with bilateral support, which I hope will continue. UNHCR, with its United Nations partner agencies, and national and international NGOs, is present in all these countries, and we are scaling up. We encourage host countries to avail themselves of our support and expert advice as they address the situation and uphold their international obligations. We're helping and can do more in areas like protection and registration, organizing reception capacity, providing emergency relief and cash assistance, and in identifying and responding to the needs of the most vulnerable, many of them women and children, including a growing number of unaccompanied and separated children. Mr. President, I regret to say that unless there is, as Martin said, an immediate halt to conflict, Ukrainians will simply continue to flee. We're currently planning, I repeat, planning, for up to 4 million refugees in the coming days and weeks. Such a rapid increase would be a huge burden for receiving states and would no doubt stress reception systems and related resources. Like all countries hosting refugees around the world, they cannot be left alone to shoulder this responsibility. I therefore welcome the support expressed by many European states at yesterday's European Union Justice and Home Affairs Council to activate the Temporary Protection Directive for people fleeing Ukraine. This would enable, if activated, immediate and temporary refuge in the European Union. It would also facilitate the sharing of responsibility for people fleeing Ukraine among European states. As Martin mentioned, we will launch the UN Humanitarian Appeal for Ukraine tomorrow for activities both inside and outside the country. Private citizens and companies from around the world have already offered extraordinary financial support through thousands of donations, over $40 million to UNHCR alone in a couple of days. And I'm counting on governments to do the same, and quickly. Ukrainians and countries hosting refugees from Ukraine cannot wait. Finally, Mr. President, a reminder that Ukrainian refugees, like all others, and please let us not forget the continuing plight of Afghans, of Syrians, of Ethiopians, of the Rohingya people from Myanmar, and of many others. All of them never wanted to be refugees. They never wanted to be forced to flee their homes, and they all hope to return to their country as quickly as possible. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, it is not very often that I get to brief the Security Council. Let me take this opportunity, therefore, to echo what I said to the Council the last time you invited me a few months ago, that humanitarian workers are courageous, resourceful, and experienced. But they cannot keep the pace of conflicts constantly growing in numbers and gravity around the world. I speak to you as a sixth night of anguish falls over Europe, struck once again by war, and as millions of innocent Ukrainian civilians huddle in bunkers, scramble to board overcrowded trains, and think with trepidation about the future of their children. Let me say, as an old humanitarian worker myself, that the responsibility that you have to ensure that eventually peace and security for all prevail over power struggles and narrow national interest has never been as urgent and as indispensable a task as it is tonight. If you fail, if we fail, it might be too late for us all. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Grande for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I thank Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Grandi for their statements. The humanitarian consequences of the Russian offensive in Ukraine are tragic. The number of civilian victims, including children, continues to increase. Cities are being bombed. Civilian infrastructure is being destroyed. Around 500,000 people have been obliged to flee and take refuge in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Moldova. This figure continues to climb hour by hour. We hail the solidarity that neighboring states have demonstrated. Russia, a permanent member of this Council, is violating the most essential principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Russia is trampling on international humanitarian law and human rights. It is riding roughshod over the Geneva Conventions. France reiterates its call for an immediate stop to hostilities, which must go before any peace talks. The protection of civilians, including children and humanitarian personnel, as well as civilian infrastructure, is an absolute priority. There is no compromise on this. We reiterate our call for safe and unimpeded humanitarian access to all people in need. We have a shared responsibility and a moral duty, that of assisting the Ukrainian population. France and its partners in the European Union stand firmly beside Ukraine and its population. The European Union has already announced 90 million euro in humanitarian assistance. France is also doing its part. It has just sent 33 tons of humanitarian assistance to Poland to help Ukrainians and is preparing to ship over 30,000 tons of humanitarian assistance to Moldova. We hail the United Nations launching tomorrow of a flash appeal for Ukraine and a regional refugee response plan for Ukrainians. We call all member states to provide financial support, and we also welcome the Secretary General's appointment of Mr. Amin Awad as United Nations coordinator for the crisis in Ukraine. The European Union sanctions adopted against Russia and Belarus will be implemented in full respect for international humanitarian law, and we will ensure that they have no impact on the humanitarian response. Mr. President, France, with Mexico, will present a draft resolution to the Council calling for full respect of international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians, and unobstructed humanitarian access in order to respond to the urgent needs of the Ukrainian population. It will be brought to a vote very quickly. France hails the courage of the people of Ukraine. Within the United Nations and in every institution, France will continue to mobilize with its partners to support the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank High Commissioner Grandi and Under Secretary Griffiths for their reports. The figures that were just shared with us and the scene described are the reflection of a humanitarian situation which is becoming increasingly grave as the hours go by. This is why, amongst other actions, Mexico and France will present a draft resolution which overall will seek a cessation of hostilities, the protection of civilians, and guaranteed access for humanitarian assistance. We deplore the fact that there are continued clashes in densely populated cities such as Kharkov, Kiev, Odessa, and others. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas is unacceptable. Mr. President, we are also very concerned at the fact that broad sectors of the population are deprived of electricity, water, and access to basic infrastructure. The communities that are becoming isolated are facing a lack of food and medicine. Health services should be conserved at all cost. We call for opening access to all humanitarian workers without restrictions so that they can provide services. As we have heard, hundreds of thousands of people have already been displaced both within Ukraine and as refugees in neighboring countries. Although these figures are very preliminary in nature, they already are alarming, and they are going to escalate very rapidly. We have to be vigilant when it comes to this increase in the days, weeks, and months to come, perhaps even the years to come. We call for keeping the borders open, as has happened with great solidarity, so that all those seeking protection can find it, and so that the principle of non-refoulement be respected. Although we recognize the right to legitimate self-defense of countries, it is also concerning that there is a substantial increase in the flow of weapons and the impact that this flow will have on the civilian population. We acknowledge the efforts of the Secretary General, including the creation of the SURF, and we are grateful for the economic commitments that several states already have made. Ukraine needs international economic solidarity today in order to respond to its urgent humanitarian needs. Lastly, Mexico clearly calls on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, particularly the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the first additional protocol of 1967, as well as international human rights law. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Martin Griffiths and High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the distinguished representative of Ukraine. Mr. President, the humanitarian suffering in Ukraine is unnecessary and uncalled for. Kenya offers its condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to the conflict in the last few days. We regret the mounting casualties, the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced and those who are exiting Ukraine as refugees, and the growing damage to civilian objects and infrastructure. Mr. President, we commend the UN for swiftly stepping in to provide humanitarian assistance. We also commend Ukraine's neighbors for opening their borders to refugees. We give a special thank you to Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovakia for working with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to enable Kenyan citizens in Ukraine visa-free entry. Mr. President, in the unfolding emergency, there have been disturbing reports about the racist treatment of Africans and people of African descent seeking to flee Ukraine to safety. The media is covering these appalling incidents, and several states have confirmed that their citizens are suffering such treatment. We strongly condemn this racism and believe that it is damaging to the spirit of solidarity that is so urgently needed today. The mistreatment of African peoples on Europe's borders needs to cease immediately, whether to the Africans fleeing Ukraine or to those crossing the Mediterranean. And we also need to be able to understand that there are actors who want to magnify this story for cynical reasons that have nothing to do with the well-being and safety of Africans. Mr. President, we're here to discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. But if we are truly to hold to humanitarian principles, then we must broaden our view. the extensive unilateral economic sanctions that have been announced against the Russian Federation are almost certain to have serious humanitarian consequences. Their effect in total may even amount to a form of blockade. It is our contention that the peaceful means to settle conflicts advocated by the UN Charter do not include acts that may constitute collective punishment. We must also add caution that such considerable sanctions, rather than opening the path to peace, may lead to an escalation and broadening of the conflict. The only way out of this increasingly dangerous crisis is for prioritization of diplomacy to limit all military maneuvers and open the path to negotiation. It is still not too late to turn towards the good offices of the Secretary General, regional organizations, and bilateral efforts to de-escalate this dangerous crisis. Whether the conflict ends now or later with even more disastrous results, it will still require an appetite to negotiate a stable security order. At this moment, statesmanship is required, and we urge all leaders of involved states to embrace their responsibility. As I close, Mr. President, I reiterate Kenya's recognition of the inviolable rights of Ukraine to its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Undersecretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi, for your truly sobering briefings. What you've briefed only underscores, I think, what the Secretary General has said, that this is a moment of great peril and great tragedy. Thank you to your agencies, your teams, for answering the call to help Ukrainians in need during this dire hour. In a matter of days, Russia's unprovoked and premeditated invasion has unleashed vast human suffering across Ukraine. We need to address the displacement and refugee crisis that we've just heard described. We need to address the food security crisis, and we need to document and address all violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law. This council just heard the latest displacement numbers, which have been rising by the hour in the last 4 days. First, it was 50,000 fled, then 150,000 fled, now 500,000 people have fled. This does not even include hundreds of thousands displaced internally within Ukraine. And behind each of these numbers are real people caught in a humanitarian nightmare unfolding before our eyes. And the truth is, no one knows where it will end. How many people will flee their homes? How many will need humanitarian assistance? How many will die? That is because we don't know when President Putin will end his war of choice against Ukraine. I want to thank the many countries and the people in the region who have opened their borders and homes to fleeing Ukrainians. The safety these people are providing underscores our common humanity during an otherwise dark moment of war. And I want to echo the calls of the United Nations Refugee Agency. We should help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees, regardless of race or creed. Of course, not everyone can or will choose to flee, and those who remain in Ukraine must be ensured unobstructed protection and assistance. 4 days into the invasion, our humanitarian partners have already identified cash, fuel constraints, volatile security conditions, and logistical challenges as key operational constraints affecting all aid delivery in the country. We also need to be very concerned by the hunger that Russia's invasion will cause. The World Food Program warns us that the food security impact of Russia's invasion will be felt far beyond Ukraine's borders. The Black Sea Basin is one of the world's most important areas for grain and agricultural exports. Vulnerable people from Asia to Africa and the Middle East will face greater levels of food insecurity as supplies are disrupted, as we are already seeing. An estimated 283 million people in over 80 countries are acutely food insecure or at high risk, and this conflict in Ukraine will only exacerbate situations already on the brink of starvation. This is yet another reason why hostilities must end now. Finally, we are gravely concerned by reports of damage to apartment buildings and schools, as well as significant infrastructure damage that has left hospitals and hundreds of thousands of people without electricity or water, while bridges and roads are damaged by shelling. Adherence to international humanitarian law is critical, including obligations related to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Humanitarian agencies must be granted secure and full access to people in need of aid. Tomorrow, as we've heard, the UN will be launching a funding appeal, an appeal for this humanitarian crisis. For our part, the United States is already providing nearly $54 million in additional humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. USAID has been airlifting and positioning relief supplies, especially needed to help older people, people with disabilities, and people displaced from their homes to face the winter weather. This is just the beginning, and much more is coming. We welcome the commitments and leadership from other nations to ensure life-saving assistance reaches those most in need. No matter what happens next, we must do everything we can to help the people of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Mr. President, I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Griffiths and High Commissioner Grandi for their sobering briefings and urgent calls to action today. The Russian Federation's unprovoked and unjustified further invasion of Ukraine continues to visit death and destruction upon the country and its people, inflicting enormous hardship and suffering. Ireland stands in unwavering solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They have shown extraordinary courage and resilience. This fresh onslaught comes on the heel of 8 years of conflict in eastern Ukraine, which had already displaced over 1.4 million people who relied on assistance to meet their daily needs. The Russian Federation's invasion has created a humanitarian catastrophe, compounding the suffering of millions with a rapidly rising toll of internally displaced persons and refugees in need of humanitarian assistance. Millions of people in Ukraine are grappling with the humanitarian consequences of a war not of their making. Innocent civilians, including children, are paying the terrible price of conflict. In Kharkiv, Kherson, and elsewhere, we have seen significant damage to essential infrastructure. This damage has left hundreds of thousands of people without electricity and water. It has deprived them of vital medical facilities, transportation services, and means of communications. This is unacceptable. Mr. President, the parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to attack only military objectives, the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Ireland is gravely concerned by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which carries a particular risk of causing civilian harm in violation of these fundamental legal obligations. We are particularly concerned by reports of indiscriminate Russian attacks and shelling in Kharkiv, causing death and destruction among the civilian population. The use of prohibited cluster munitions by Russian forces has been reported. If confirmed, this is a further damning indictment of its military aggression. Cluster munitions are by nature indiscriminate, and we condemn all use of these weapons in all circumstances. Ireland urges against attacks on infrastructure and installations, including nuclear power plants. Such attacks would have profound effects on the health of millions and render the surrounding environment uninhabitable for generations to come. Any armed attack on and threat against nuclear facilities devoted to peaceful purposes constitutes a violation of international law, including the principles of the United Nations Charter, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, and the IAEA Statute. We also express our great concern at the deployment of weapons and armaments or conducting missile strikes directly from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Mr. President, the Russian Federation must protect all civilians in Ukraine. We recall its obligations to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. The safety of all humanitarian and medical workers must be ensured. Humanitarians must not be prevented from ensuring principled assistance is delivered where it is most needed and when it is most needed. Ireland and its EU partners are providing significant humanitarian support, and we stand ready to do more. We commend our EU partners and Moldova for their generosity and solidarity in providing shelter to hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the war. They are deserving of our support in providing timely humanitarian assistance, especially to the most vulnerable, the elderly, the young, and the sick. We appeal to all countries in the region to keep their borders open to all of those seeking safety and protection. Ireland is already providing humanitarian support, including core funding to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as well as announcing a €10 million humanitarian package in recent days. When conflicts rage, unpredictable, even barely conceivable outcomes can become all too real. Threats to unleash forces that cannot be controlled, including threats of nuclear weapons, are utterly unacceptable. Ireland has long argued that nuclear weapons offer no security. Their use would cause devastation in the region and beyond, bringing a new blight on humanity for generations to come. That is not a prospect that any of us should be willing to contemplate. Mr. President, we urge the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from further threats or the use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other member state. In sum, we urge Russia to turn away from war and choose the path of dialogue and diplomacy. This is the right path, and the time to take it is now, before any more lives are ruined or lost. Thank you.
Спасибо.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Norway.
President, let me thank the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Martin Griffiths, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, for their frank accounts of the consequences of the Russian invasion for the civilians in Ukraine. We need your strong leadership in the response to this unfolding humanitarian crisis. Norway is stepping up our support to the civilian population in Ukraine. The government has announced it will provide up to $226 million to the humanitarian response. Let me start by underlining that Russia, and Russia alone, bears the sole responsibility for this humanitarian crisis through its unprovoked, unjustified, and irresponsible military aggression. It has blatantly violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The parties to the conflict in Ukraine must comply with their obligation under international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law. They must ensure the protection of the civilian population in all of Ukraine. We demand that all parties ensure the respect for and protection for all medical personnel exclusively engaged in medical duties, their means of transport and equipment, as well as hospitals and other medical facilities. We are calling on parties to the conflict to protect all humanitarian personnel and ensure and facilitate safe rapid, and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid for those in need. The space for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian action must be restored and protected. Fighting is going on in and around urban areas with the use of heavy explosive weapons. We are deeply concerned about the long-term harm to the civilians, including children, and civilian infrastructure. Homes, schools, hospitals, water plants, and other civilian infrastructure is being damaged and destroyed. We are deeply concerned about the reported use of cluster munitions. Explosive remnants of war will continue to kill and injure even after the conflict ends, and they will prevent people from returning home, going to school, coming back to work, and rebuilding their communities. Hundreds of thousands of civilians are fleeing the conflict. We commend the neighboring countries for keeping their borders open and for the great generosity and solidarity shown with people fleeing the conflict. The door to safety and protection must remain open to all those in need without discrimination. We will do our part, including providing support. This weekend, 2 media workers were shot and injured. Journalists and media workers are civilians under international humanitarian law. The world relies on independent and truthful reporting of the events that are unfolding. The heroic efforts of Ukrainian and international press are incredibly important. We urge all parties to respect and protect the press, both on the ground and online. We demand the unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine to restore the respect of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and prevent further civilian suffering. Russia started the war in Ukraine. It can choose to stop it now. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, USG Griffiths and UNHCR Grandi, for those startling updates on the catastrophic situation unfolding in Ukraine. Dear colleagues, with its unprovoked aggression, Russia is causing an unprecedented humanitarian situation in Ukraine on a scale that Europe has not seen in decades. We all know the toll of war. In every conflict, it is civilian populations that bear the worst of the consequences, that pay the high price. Conflicts equal with innocent victims, destruction, displacement and refugees, severe human suffering. Those who initiate conflicts do know this. We heard that the situation is alarming. UNHCR Grandi mentioned staggering numbers of hundreds of thousands of people on the move in and out of Ukraine, and all this in a matter of days. Women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities are currently the most in need. As this aggression goes on, civilians everywhere in Ukraine are terrified of what awaits them, when the rocket is going to fall on their roof, or what other ways this absurd war will affect them. International law is clear. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure constitutes serious crimes, and perpetrators must be held accountable. There is no justification for this war, as there is no justification when bridges are destroyed, when infrastructure is deliberately targeted, when missiles hit residential areas. Dear colleagues, we're happy to hear that despite hostilities, the UN operation in Ukraine has expanded. We support a strong and reinforced presence of the United Nations and humanitarian partners on the ground. We support the safe, unimpeded access and protection of humanitarian workers and the deliveries to the areas affected by conflict. Our messages are clear. Civilian and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Security and access for humanitarian efforts must be guaranteed. Safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its people is and should remain a priority. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld, in particular the four Geneva Conventions and their first additional protocol. Human rights violations and other crimes must be documented for the purpose of accountability. We commend all countries that are hosting refugees. As already announced last week by Prime Minister Rama, we are happy to shelter Ukrainians forced to flee because of the war. Albania has joined the wide array of sanctions recently adopted by the European Union. The airspace of Albania has been closed to all Russian operators except for flights conducted for emergency and humanitarian needs. We are working to provide assistance in military and hospital supplies to Ukraine. Dear colleagues, the decisions and actions of the coming days will directly affect the lives of millions of people. What is happening in Ukraine should not happen anywhere. We need peace, not war. We need friendship, not aggression. We are and will stand with Ukraine. Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UN High Commissioner Filippo Grandi for their briefing. India remains deeply concerned at the unfolding developments in Ukraine, where the situation continues to deteriorate. Our considered call for immediate cessation of violence and an end to all hostilities is an urgent imperative. India's Prime Minister has advocated this strongly in his recent conversations with the leadership of the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We welcome the commencement of direct talks. We reiterate our conviction that differences can only be bridged through sustained dialogue and diplomacy. We also underline that all members have agreed on the principles, the UN Charter, international law, and on the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. There is an urgent and pressing humanitarian situation developing in Ukraine. In such times of conflict, India attaches the highest priority to the safety and well-being of civilians, in particular women, children, and the elderly. We are of the view that core principles of humanitarian assistance should be fully honored. Taking into account the humanitarian requirements in Ukraine, my government has also decided to provide urgent relief supplies, including medicines, and these are being dispatched tomorrow. We remain deeply concerned for the safety and security of thousands of Indian citizens, including students, stranded in Ukraine. Our evacuation efforts have been adversely impacted by the developments on the ground at the border crossings. Given that the safety of Indian nationals is of paramount importance to my government, senior ministers from the Government of India are being deployed as special envoys to Ukraine's neighboring countries. We thank them for their cooperation at this difficult time. We stand ready to help those from our neighbors and developing countries who are also stranded in Ukraine and may seek assistance. We also support all UN humanitarian efforts. As reiterated yesterday, there is no other option but to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue as the only way ahead. I thank you, Mr. President.
ਇਹ ਸਨ ਅੱਜ ਦੀਆਂ ਮੁੱਖ ਖਬਰਾਂ। ਮੈਨੂੰ ਮਨਪ੍ਰੀਤ ਕੌਰ ਨੂੰ ਦਿਓ ਇਜਾਜ਼ਤ ਤੇ ਹੋਰ ਵਧੇਰੇ ਖਬਰਾਂ ਲਈ ਜੁੜੇ ਰਹੋ ਇੰਡੀਆ+ USA ਦੇ ਨਾਲ।